Well, thanks so much for joining us today on The Line of Fire. Over the months and years, we've often talked about Islam. I've often warned about radical Islam and interacted with teachings of the Quran. I've also sought to interact with Muslims and discuss the gospel as well. But the question that always comes up is the nature of Islam. Is Islam, by its very nature, true to its original sources and the example of the life of Muhammad, always going to have a violent expression, always going to believe in some form of jihad, or maybe not as bad as ISIS, but it will be a violent religion? Or is it possible to be true to the Quran and Muhammad, the original sources and theology and history, and somehow be a peace-loving Muslim? And say, yeah, at times of war, that's one thing, but otherwise we're peace-loving and we deplore what these other groups do. Are there different forms of Islam? That's what we want to discuss today, and I've got two experts on with me. Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch, which is a program of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, author of 17 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades. I often go to his website, jihadwatch.org. Mr. Spencer, thanks so much for joining us on the broadcast today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, and joining him is Dr. James White. We've been on the first hour talking about an interfaith dialogue he had with a Muslim imam earlier in the year, but now we're focusing on this topic. James White is the director of Alpha and Omega Ministries, the author of many books, and most particularly what every Christian should know about the Quran. James, Dr. White, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
All right, so Robert, if you could take a minute and give your basic thesis, then I want James to do it, and then you'll unpack it both longer in the next segment. So, Robert, starting with you for a minute.
Absolutely. While it's certainly true that not every Muslim is waging jihad or ever will wage jihad or needs to wage jihad in Islamic theology, the Quran envisions jihad as something that is violent. Muhammad, who is exemplary for Muslims in terms of the highest example to be imitated, fought in battles and exhorted Muslims to do so. The Quran says that those believers who sit at home are not equal to those who strive in the way of Allah, that is, wage jihad in the way of Allah, with their possessions and their lives, which makes it very clear we're talking about battle and not about some sort of spiritual struggle. And Islamic law, in all of the various schools of jurisprudence, both Sunni and Shia, all of the mainstream sects of Islam, all of them are unanimous in teaching that it is the responsibility of the Islamic community to wage war against unbelievers and subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. And so violence is inherent in Islam in all of its traditional and classic formulations.
All right, 1 minute exactly. James, over to you.
Well, obviously, the real issue here is, do we demand that we apply a Protestant sola scriptura, the earliest sources are the only type thing, lens upon Islam, or do we recognize that Islam developed its own jurisprudence over time that provided for a limitation on the nature of jihad, when jihad could take place, what jihad is, the role of the caliphate, so on and so forth. And so while there's no question that there is a tremendous amount of basis for the argumentation of violence in the promulgation of Islam, there is also very clearly no consistency. And this is the issue, is I'm going to be arguing, I have to argue, that the original sources themselves are not consistent with themselves as divine revelations. This is one of my primary arguments against the idea that the Quran is the Word of God to begin with.
All right, friends, we come back. We're going to hear from Robert Spencer, 5 minutes supporting his position, and Dr. White, 5 minutes supporting his position. And then we'll continue to go, and then ultimately with interaction between the two gentlemen as we discuss the real nature of Islam. We are discussing today the true nature of Islam. If you're consistent with the sources, will you be ultimately a violent Muslim or a Muslim who supports violent jihad, or are the sources not consistent? Two experts debating this, Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch and James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries. Robert, over to you for 5 minutes to present your side.
Yes, in the first place, Dr. White started out by saying that what we must not do is apply some sort of Protestant sola scriptura analysis to Islam, and that is absolutely true. That's exactly what I am not doing. What we have to do is take Islam on its own terms. He mentioned its schools of jurisprudence, and that is exactly what we need to look at, because every Sunni Muslim and every Shiite Muslim, with very few exceptions, adheres to one of the schools of jurisprudence. In the Sunni world, the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali schools, these are not brick-and-mortar schools. These are schools of thought, ways of understanding Islam. And all of them, the Shiites also, the Jafari school is a Shiite school, and other Shiite schools, they all give a Muslim an understanding. It's not just a sola scriptura religion that a Muslim reads the Quran and comes to an idea of what it means. It is a religion of authority, and the authorities come from these schools of jurisprudence. Every one of these schools of jurisprudence is unanimous in saying that it is a responsibility of the Muslim community to make war against Jews, Christians, and other non-Muslims in order to bring them into the Islamic social order, which means that they pay the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims, and accept various humiliating and discriminatory regulations, or else they go to war with the Muslims. The Muslims go to war with them, that is. This is something that is taught by all four schools of jurisprudence among the Sunnis, as well as by the Shiites. It is something that is taught by Muhammad and something that is exemplified by Muhammad. So the thing is that Dr. White is also correct when he says there is no consistency in the original sources, but this is something that these schools of jurisprudence all deal with, because in the early part of Muhammad's career, he did not teach warfare against unbelievers. But when he moved at the Hijrah from Mecca to Medina, he began to preach in the first place defensive jihad and then offensive jihad. The first biographer of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq, in the 8th century, he actually explained that there is a progression in the Quran in its understanding of jihad. First, tolerance, then defensive jihad, and finally offensive jihad, which is the stage that is valid for all time. Although when Muslims are a small group that is threatened by a large majority of unbelievers, then they also will preach tolerance in the manner of the first stage. But it is always tending toward the second and third stage. So Dr. White is broadly correct that there's no consistency in the sources, but this is an inconsistency that has been dealt with by Islamic jurisprudence all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Qayyim, Ibn Kathir, the pioneering sociologist Ibn Khaldun, and many other Islamic authorities, all the way throughout Islamic history, down to the 20th century, have taught that the offensive jihad, the verses involving fighting, like, for example, chapter 8, verse 39 of the Quran, fight until religion is all for Allah. Chapter 9, verse 29, which says, fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, which is primarily Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, that these kinds of verses take precedence over verses such as chapter 109 of the Quran, which says, say to the unbelievers, I don't worship what you worship, and you don't worship what I worship, and we're not going to worship what each other worships, and so essentially we'll just leave each other alone. That the verses of fighting, of warfare, they take precedence over the verses of peace. And so, for example, you have a Hanafi manual of Islamic law saying that because the Prophet, Muhammad, who is, of course, exemplary for Muslim behavior, instructed his commanders, directing them to call the infidels to the faith, first the Muslims call the infidels to the faith, so that the people will hence perceive that they are being attacked for the sake of religion, and not just for the sake of taking their property. In other words, it's enjoining religious warfare and saying that this is something that Muslims have a responsibility to fight. Sayyid Abu Alam al-Dudi, the 20th century jihad theorist in Pakistan, said the same thing in his multi-volume exegesis of the Quran, that Muslims have a responsibility to wage war to impose Sharia over the world. So they understood that there are other things in the sources teaching peace, but they always taught in accord with the principle of abrogation, based also on the Quran, that what comes chronologically later supersedes what comes chronologically earlier, that the warfare superseded the tolerance.
All right. Thank you. Now, Dr. White, back to you.
Well, we've already had pretty much everything we need laid out right there, and now we've gotten to the real issue right there at the end, and that is if we are having to deal with the Islamic sources engaging in prioritizing their materials, saying, well, this has precedence over that. This requires us to utilize the law of abrogation, for example. I have, in my experience, never found the law of abrogation to be applied in the exact same way by almost anybody. It's amazing how easy it is to utilize law of abrogation to basically come up with your own particular perspectives. And whenever a sect arises in Islam, and there have been many of them, they utilize the law of abrogation to reorganize things. The same thing is true with the study of the Hadith. When you start looking at this massive amount of information and you actually start reading the Hadith, you discover very, very quickly that by prioritizing how you're going to view them, by putting one quotation over another quotation, it's very easy to change the tenor and the tone of what you're going to be presenting from the Hadith. And since the Hadith become the lens through which the Quran itself is to be interpreted, and has to be the lens through which the Quran itself is interpreted, for the simple reason that the Quran, being so short and being so non-mubinun, it is not clear in its presentation. You cannot exegete it the way you can the New Testament. You have to have a lens through which you're going to be reading it. And the many, many, many different readings of the Quran that have come about as a result, and the interpretations of different passages, is due to the fact that you can create the lens that you want to create from the Hadith. And so my problem with the entire thesis statement is this idea that there is a quote-unquote true Islam. Who's getting to define that? How do we define that? And that's why I said at the beginning, in listening, for example, to Dr. Qadi, one of the things he said that was fascinating to me is he said, well, the Salafi, the Wahhabi, they basically are like the Reformers. And what they've done is they've gotten rid of all of the later developments of tradition, saying this wasn't coming from those original sources, this wasn't coming from the people that were around the Prophet. And so they've gotten rid of all the things that provided a buffer against this type of activity. And that's why they fight with each other. That's why they can't agree on theology. That's why they're in the mess that they're in, which is very similar to the arguments that Roman Catholics use against the Protestants and saying there's all these different groups and all these different perspectives, things like that. And so when we say what is true Islam, we have to ask ourselves the question, do you mean what is the view of Muhammad? Well, I don't know that anyone can know that. In fact, Robert Spencer has a book, Did Muhammad Exist? So if you question whether Muhammad existed, I don't know how you can know what he would have thought if he didn't actually exist. So how can we even know? When I read the Hadith, it seems very, very clear to me that we're reading stories that have developed over a tremendous period of time and in different directions. There does seem to be a core of some type of historical element to it, but so much of it develops over time. And again, by looking at it, you can go, well, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, they're going to look at this strain of traditions in the Hadith, and they're going to use that to create their theology, and that's going to be a very violent theology, no question about it. But then others look at this strain of the Hadith, and they're not going to look at the same way as Boko Haram. The people, for example, who as Muslims desire the education of women, for example, are going to prioritize certain Hadith over other Hadith. The inconsistency of these sources is, to me, one of the strongest arguments against the divine nature of Islam, because you can say the Quran was written on heavenly tablets and sent down during Ramadan, and you can say it's been absolutely perfectly preserved for us, but the fact of the matter is it cannot define itself. It is not sufficient in and of itself to define itself, and when you add the Hadith in, it doesn't help the situation, it hurts the situation. And so I don't believe that there is a quote-unquote true Islam to begin with. I don't think the historical documents can give us a solid enough basis for that. And so since my biggest emphasis is seeking to reach people where they are, then I want to reach them with what their beliefs are and not try to enforce something upon them.
All right, friends, we come back. I actually have a question for Robert Spencer and a question for James White, and then they're going to be able to question and cross-examine each other. Stay tuned. All right, actually, I got slightly ahead of myself. I will raise some questions in the next segment. But first, back to Robert Spencer for a 4-minute response rebuttal to Dr. White.
Yes. In the first place, I think that Dr. White and I both agree that it's ridiculous to say there's any true Islam, because there isn't any single authority that can define what that would be. However, we can and should look at the mainstream authorities within Islam, as I explained in the earlier segment, and those are all unanimous in saying that jihad involves violence against unbelievers, and that violence against unbelievers is a blessed act that will bring rewards to the believer. Dr. White is correct that the Hadith contain all kinds of different things, but it's really kind of ridiculous for him to say that because I question the historicity of Muhammad, therefore we can't know anything about what Muhammad actually said and did. It's just like if I say, Macbeth said, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" Well, Macbeth really said that. It's in the play, but that doesn't mean Macbeth was a historical character. And it's the same thing with Muhammad. Muhammad says and does all sorts of things in the Hadith that we can and should know about, but that doesn't mean they have any historicity. Now, the historicity of Muhammad is a separate question, but the content of Muhammad's teaching is very important because it formulates Islamic law. And Muhammad is very clear in the Hadith. It's not true, while it's true that there are all sorts of contradictory Hadith about all kinds of matters, Dr. White will not be able to invoke a single Hadith in which Muhammad is saying, live at peace and coexist with the unbelievers on an indefinite basis and don't go to war with them. There is no such Hadith, but there are many such Hadiths that say, for example, Muhammad says, I've been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah and that I am his messenger, or where he tells his followers to, in the first place, invite the unbelievers to accept Islam and then invite them to pay the jizya. If they refuse both, then to fight them, where Muhammad says, I have been made victorious with terror, where it's very clear that he doesn't mean some sort of religious awe, but terror in the sense of being terrorized. Muhammad himself practiced this. In a notorious incident, there were some people who stole some of the camels and made off with them, and Muhammad ordered people to go and follow them and find them, and then he ordered them to have their hands and feet cut off on opposite sides, which is in accord with the Quran in chapter 5, verse 33, and had them staked out in the desert, and their cries for water to be ignored, and so on. This is somebody who mandated violence, who practiced violence, who exhorted his followers to engage in violence, and this is why all the major schools of Islamic jurisprudence are unanimous in teaching that violence is integral to the application of Islam for the believer. Now, violence is fard kifaya, a communal obligation on the Muslim community in general, so if one part of the Muslim community is discharging it, another does not have to. So not every Muslim has to engage in violence in order to be a true Muslim. But there is no sect of Islam that teaches peace. There is no school of jurisprudence of Islam that teaches that Muslims should coexist with unbelievers as equals. Every last sect and every last school, working from this massive hadith that Dr. White rightly notes is contradictory, they see in it, and all of them do. It's odd that there's not even a single one that sees any peace in it. They all see a mandate to wage war against and to subjugate unbelievers as inferiors, denied basic rights under the rule of Islamic law. And we have to remember that that is the goal of jihad. It's not just undifferentiated mayhem. It is designed to weaken the infidels and ultimately to bring them under the sway and under the government of Islam. As Maududi says, non-believers have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth, and if they do, the believers have the responsibility to take up arms and dislodge them from that power.
All right, thank you. Now, James White, back to you for 4 minutes.
I'm a little confused about what was just said in regards to Macbeth and Muhammad. I'm still. It sounds like if the thesis of the debate was true Islam is always violent, if we're saying there is no such thing as true Islam, that Islam has always been had all these different kinds of characteristics to it, and that there's differences between people, maybe what should have been said is you can interpret the various schools of jurisprudence in such a way that they all demand jihad, as long as you don't then also include the limitations upon jihad, the requirements when you live in a non-Muslim land. We haven't defined yet, and unfortunately, as time gets shorter and shorter each segment, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam, what the difference is between the world that is submitted to Allah, the world that is the reign of war, so on and so forth. That's unfortunate, but I was completely lost as to the relationship of Macbeth and Muhammad. If Muhammad didn't exist, then what you have is some kind of development over time of what becomes the foundation of the various schools of jurisprudence. Where did that come from? And if there wasn't a Muhammad, then how could there be such consistency amongst these schools of jurisprudence? Is something that I think we really have to think about. But once again, the question becomes, if we're using laws of abrogation to come up with all of this type of interpretation to begin with, what do you do with the people that you live with today who look at the stories of Muhammad and they emphasize the pre-Hijra stories? So they emphasize the stories when he was a minority prophet, when he himself was seeking religious freedom. Upon what basis are those abrogated? And if they do believe those things to be relevant to their faith today, do you say to them, you're not a true Muslim? Or do you just simply say, well, historically, the large portion of your leaders in the past have not taken the same perspective that you have? Is that then meant to be an argument that is supposed to lead them to, one of two things? I'm not sure. Do we want to actually try to argue to Muslims that to be a true Muslim, you need to become violent? I'm not sure that's what we want to do, even though I have, for example, many times in the past argued that the vast difference between the Christian message and the Islamic message is that the messenger, the one that we are presenting to people, Jesus Christ, is not a person that you can hold up entire books about their various military campaigns. But you can with Muhammad, and that one of the great dangers of Islam is that it has enshrined at least a later understanding of this man, Muhammad, one that I would say evolved over time and not necessarily reflects the original Muhammad if if we could even dig past the various historical developments to get to him. But since that is what has been happening, since he has been called the best of humanity, then what you've done is you have established someone who has all of these character issues to deal with, and there has not been any type of meaningful understanding of what came beforehand in the other books that the Quran says were also contained light and guidance, which would help you to in any way ameliorate the exaltation of the militaristic aspects of that individual's character. Now, thankfully, there are some Muslims that don't want to emphasize that, but they are unfortunately in the minority, but they still exist. What do we do about them? And I keep hearing music right before my time runs out.
All right. That's what happens when you go second on a radio show. We come back. I've got a question for Robert Spencer, a question for James White. Then they can go at each other. We are right now in the midst of a very clearly presented debate on the nature of Islam. Does it consistently point to violent jihad against unbelievers, or is it inconsistent and there are various expressions of Islam, some of which may be violent, some peace-loving? The former position is being advocated by Robert Spencer of jihadwatch.org, a best-selling author on Islam. The latter position is being advocated by James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries, and also a best-selling author. His book on Quran for Christians, well known as well. I have a question for Robert Spencer, then a question for James White, and then I want to give them opportunity to cross-examine one another. Robert, when there's an attack in the world that looks like it could be terrorist, I immediately go to Jihad Watch because you seem to know pretty quickly whether it's a terrorist attack or not. And then we'll hear the constant mantra from all the leaders in the West that this is not Islam. I write about it constantly. I often reference Jihad Watch. What would you say to those who see the latest terrorist attack carried out by Islamic extremists who say this is not Islam? Can you take 60 seconds to say what you would say to them?
when the attackers themselves make it clear that they are acting in the name of Islam, it's foolhardy in the extreme to pretend that they're not. We should take them at their word. For example, today, a Muslim in an airport in Flint, Michigan, stabbed a policeman in the neck while screaming Allahu Akbar. And the police said, this is potentially an act of terrorism. Well, I don't know what on earth the poor man could do to establish that it's an act of terrorism beyond what he's already done. We need to understand what the jihadis themselves are saying about themselves in order to be able to counter them effectively. And this willful ignorance on the part of authorities, which is designed to keep people essentially complacent about the full magnitude of this threat, is ultimately extraordinarily dangerous and is going to expose us further to the threat because it's not being countered honestly or effectively.
Just if you could expand just for, say, 30 more seconds, why do you think so many people get this wrong in the West?
I'm sorry, you're almost inaudible there. Why do I think what?
Why do you think so many in the West have gotten this wrong? If you could just take maybe 30 seconds.
There's a concerted effort by the media and by governing officials to obfuscate terror attacks and to downplay and denigrate, deny outright any Islamic connection to them. And so routinely we see in the mainstream media that there's a guy screaming Allahu Akbar, even quoting the Quran, saying, like Omar Mateen did in Orlando, that he's doing it for ISIS, the Islamic State, and then we read that it's really about something else, that they're mentally ill, that they had family problems, something of that kind. It seems as if there is a very high-level effort to make sure that people do not realize the full magnitude of what is going on in this.
So it's somewhat suicidal, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
It is somewhat suicidal, is it not?
Oh, no doubt. It's directly suicidal. And if you guys could turn up the volume on this, it's very hard to hear suddenly.
All right. Not sure what happened there. I think everything's the same on our end, but we'll work on that. James, let me put this question to you, and then you can answer it on the other side of the break. And then, Robert and James, you can interact and question one another. But, James, here's my question to you. I look at the way you have debated Muslims in the mosques and in other settings as a real model, that you're familiar with their material, you're respectful to them, but you loudly and clearly present Jesus to them. So my question to you, and you can answer it on the other side of the break and take a couple of minutes to answer, is what concerns you in terms of gospel outreach when the latest terrorist attack takes place and people say, well, that's all Muslims are like ISIS. And a lot of Christians think, yeah, all Muslims are like ISIS, and if they say they're not, they're lying. So, James, you can answer that on the other side of the break. Take a couple minutes to do it. And then, Robert, your turn to ask James a question, to cross-examine him, and then back and forth we will go. We're having an important discussion about the nature of Islam with two experts on the subject. Robert Spence, you can read his Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, his website, jihadwatch.org. James White, you can read his book, What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Quran, his website, aomin.org. So, James, my question to you before the break was, what does it concern you when there's the latest Islamic terrorist attack and a lot of Christians think, well, all Muslims are terrorists?
Well, what it does is it unfortunately closes doors an opportunity of presenting the gospel to individuals because it creates fear in people's minds. And certainly there is reason to be fearful of individuals who engage in such type of activity. I can't look into people's hearts and minds. I can't look into that man who today in Flint, Michigan, engages in this type of activity any more than I could look into the heart and mind of the individual that drove the van into the Muslims just a few days earlier in London. I can't see those things. And so if you put yourself out there to present the gospel, you are risking yourself, and you have to place yourself in the hands of God at that point. But my real concern is I'm looking at ways of opening up avenues of communication between Christians and Muslims, because for me, given the nature of Islam, given that I do not believe, this has been an argument of mine for many, many years, I do not believe that the original sources of Islam are sufficient to be able to end the disputes between the various Muslim groups and the infighting. And remember, ISIS primarily kills Muslims as their victims, as well as Christians and others. I don't believe that the original sources of Islam are able to answer those questions. So what's the only true final solution? I believe it's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I want to see every opportunity of doors opening. And unfortunately, the way things are being dealt with, because the media, look, when someone yells Allahu Akbar, you need to recognize, yes, this person is claiming an Islamic understanding of what they're doing. But then you also have to be honest and go, look, when a Christian does something, don't we want to be able to ask the question, how much this person really know? How well studied were they? What perspective are they coming from? We want to have that type of freedom, and we need to extend that freedom to the other side. And so it bothers me when people say, well, it's just all of Islam, without making the necessary distinctions to recognize the differences that actually exist.
All right, and I wanted to ask those two questions, gentlemen, only to emphasize not just the truth about the various questions, but why you each do what you do. There's a different motivation behind it. Nonetheless, we come back to the discussion, is Islam consistently violent or not? Can you be a genuine, devout, serious Muslim and be peace-loving and renounce violent jihad? So, Robert, your time now to begin cross-examination. You can ask James a question, and if you need to clarify it, go back and forth a little fine, then we'll switch over to James asking you. So, over to you, Robert.
Thank you. Actually, Dr. White already asked me a question earlier. What would you say to Muslims who prefer the Meccan passages of the Quran, which generally teach a form of tolerance, rather than the Medinan passages that teach warfare? And what I would say to them, and in leading up to my question to Dr. White, is to note that Mahmud Muhammad Taha, the great Sudanese Muslim theologian, was executed as a heretic by the Sudanese government, which is a Sharia government, an Islamic law, a government according to Islamic law, in 1985 for preaching exactly that. And so what I would ask Dr. White in turn is what would he say, how would he ask those Muslims that claim that they are Meccan and not Medinan Muslims, how would he ask them that how does he propose that they protect themselves from charges of heresy from the mainstream dominant view that Islam teaches violence among Muslims, that is, and that can he name, please, a school of jurisprudence or a sect of Islam that actually teaches peace and coexistence as equals with non-Muslims?
Well, there are a number of things there, but I think the very question sort of establishes the thesis of the debate. Unless you're going to say that the man who was executed by the Sudanese government was not a Muslim, then you have Muslims killing Muslims over disagreements on this very issue, which sort of is the point of why I even agreed to do this. And that is, I know too many Muslims who interpret the history of Islam, not just the original document, but they then interpret even the schools of jurisprudence in light of the history of Islam and the history of the development of through the Abbasid dynasty and so on and so forth. There's been a lot of theological... Look, if we can recognize that even the view that the Quran is eternal amongst the Sunnis, I mean, this is a difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites. If we can recognize that something as central as that developed over time, and it was not an original concept, but came into existence over time, if something as basic as that can be the result of the process of the development of theology, then obviously many other things can as well. And the people looking from our perspective backwards say, well, there's the process of development. This is the stream that I see, that I want to be a part of, that expresses what I understand of Islam. And so the terrible thing is that the Sudanese government would act in that way, and that the only place you can be free to have that perspective is outside of where Sharia becomes established. That's one of the arguments.
And why would that be? Wouldn't that be because of the nature of Sharia itself?
That would be because of the way that Sharia is applied. As you know, there's different ways of understanding and applying Sharia. The very fact that in African Islam contexts, up until the past, 120 years? Somewhere, well, actually more like 80 years, I guess. There was tremendous freedom, even amongst Muslims and Christians and Aboriginal tribes and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but that was a retreat from Sharia. That wasn't Sharia. 70% of all the rulings are established by consensus, ijma, among the various schools of jurisprudence. In Africa, there were many areas where Sharia was not applied, but that wasn't some moderate form of Sharia. So I ask again, can you please identify, outside from one individual who was executed as a heretic, can you please identify a sect or school of Islamic thought that teaches peace and coexistence with non-believers as equals?
Well, again, peace and coexistence of non-believers as equals. Of course not, because of the fact that you have shirk and you have the understanding of the Ummah and the division between the Dar al-Harb and the Dar al-Islam. But I'm afraid that you're utilizing that terminology there in somewhat of a double entendre or something along those lines. There is no question that Islam views those who submit to Allah to be in right relationship with Allah, and they want to have God's law applied across the board. The question is there a proper way, or is there any way at all that a believing person can interpret those same historical laws in such a way that they, for example, believe that if you are in contract, if you are a member of another society, if you are under the laws of another society, that you cannot engage in rebellion against that society? And as you know, that has been a decision that has been made many times in the history of Islam.
Yes, but it's provisional until Muslims attain sufficient strength in order to apply Islamic law, as I'm sure you're also aware. So the question once again becomes, is there then a school of thought that rejects violence against unbelievers, that rejects the idea that one must wage war against unbelievers and make them submit as inferiors under the rules of Sharia to pay the jizya, to not build new churches, that kind of thing?
There is absolutely no question that that particular understanding of the application of, for example, Surah 9 is extremely prominent. However, what I was trying to say, you said, well, that's provisional until something takes place. Well, what do you mean by, well, I'm not asking questions right now, even though you've been making a lot of statements, but when you say that's provisional in the sense that this person is allowed to engage in active violence to hasten this, or provisional in the sense that they accept that in this particular land, this is the case of the law that comes to exist?
Yeah, well, actually, the rulings are generally that if Muslims attain a majority, then they can begin to apply Islamic law. And some schools consider that it's impermissible to engage in jihad activity until that point, but at the same time, they're working toward that point. And so the goal remains the same.
And, of course, the reality that all of these schools, one of the important elements of this, where ISIS and the others have rejected these Islamic schools, which you haven't brought up, is the necessity of the caliphate, which is why ISIS is so fixated on the concept of the caliphate, right?
Of course. But see, this is very important as well, that ISIS is not killing other Muslims because it's some sort of a non-Muslim entity. It's killing other Muslims because it believes that it's the caliphate and that all Muslims owe allegiance to it, and that therefore those who are not allied with it are heretics or apostates, and thus under the death penalty for heresy and apostasy.
Which is why they also attack al-Qaeda, right?
Well, this is the same thing, that al-Qaeda is a rival jihad group. And so obviously they don't accept the caliphate, but they're both working from the same principles that one must do violence to those who are outside the fold. And that is the core of our debate here, that violence is core and is taught by all the various groups in Islam. And it is not something that is only the province of one group or another group, and then there's other peaceful groups, because we still don't have the name of any peaceful group.
All right, tell you what, just got to jump in here. Dr. White, we resume, finish your point, and then you can begin to question Robert Spencer. And feel free to question, make statements, be free in the interaction. But we start, Dr. White. Continue the interaction with Robert Spencer and James White on the nature of Islam. So, James, over to you to respond and then to begin your questioning of Robert Spencer.
Well, what I was trying to get to there a number of times toward the end was the reason that there is so much infighting between these various groups is because they don't have the same theology and the same understanding. ISIS establishes the caliphate because they recognize that historically there has to be a caliph for jihad to exist, and al-Qaeda specifically rejected that. If you read the writings of al-Qaeda that they put out, they said that a state of jihad exists and there does not need to be a caliphate. And so my point was, isn't that one of the demonstrations of the fact that this idea that there is a single one true Islam. There's lots of differences, and one of those differences is this idea of the necessity of the caliphate.
All right, so with that, we turn things now to James. You can.
So that was my question.
I'm sorry, my bad. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Robert.
I'm sure Robert was sitting there trying to talk and was muted the whole time.
No. He's right here. He's here. Yeah, he's been here the whole time.
Yeah, this is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Islamic theology of jihad. Al-Qaeda declared that there did not need to be a caliphate because Al-Qaeda was saying that it was a defensive jihad. In Islamic theology, since the 9th century, since the formulation of the theology of jihad, there has been the idea of offensive jihad and defensive jihad. Offensive jihad requires the caliph to call it, and the caliph has the responsibility to call it at least once a year. But in the absence of a caliph, it's not as if there isn't any jihad. Jihad is, as I said very much earlier, fard kifaya, an obligation on the whole community. But if a Muslim land is attacked, then jihad becomes fard ayn, which is an obligation on every individual Muslim and does not need the permission or the call of a caliph. And so what Al-Qaeda was arguing was not that there's no caliph necessary. They weren't going against traditional Islamic theology. They wouldn't have dared. They were instead just saying that we are in a state of defensive jihad because Muslim lands have been attacked. Osama bin Laden even invoked the presence of American soldiers in Saudi Arabia to claim that Muslim lands were attacked. But also there was Iraq and Afghanistan after that. It became a much easier case to make. Then ISIS, which comes from Al-Qaeda, went with them one better. They didn't disagree with any of that exegesis, but they said that the caliphate was now back. And so they were able to declare offensive jihad, and the jihad did not all need to be defensive. So when a deceptive Islamic apologist like Yasser Qadi comes in to the U.S. and he tells people there's no jihad because there's no caliph, he is being actively misleading because he knows full well that defensive jihad is something that is a responsibility of every individual Muslim if a Muslim land is attacked, and that was Al-Qaeda's case. But he fosters complacency and ignorance among non-Muslims who aren't aware of jihad theology by making it seem as if all these various jihads around the world today are illegitimate since there's no recognized caliph.
So when he actually gives entire lectures where he contextualizes those, talks about both offensive, defensive, talks about the caliph, and then also includes the information concerning the necessity when you are considered to be under contract, you have a covenant of oath of loyalty to a nation, and the relevance of that. Is that just what he's giving to the Muslims, or was I just not supposed to be listening to those things, or how do you have knowledge of his heart and intentions, even when he has to protect he and his family because ISIS wants him dead?
I never claimed any knowledge of his heart or intention. That's quite.
You just called him a jihadi apologist, didn't you?
Yeah, well, that's what he is. That's obvious from his words, from what he has said. But the fact is that ISIS has him on a list because he is affiliated with Brotherhood groups. The Muslim Brotherhood is a very large rival of ISIS in wanting to establish a caliphate of its own. They had their big chance in Egypt in 2012, and they blew it when Mohammed Morsi was toppled from power in 2013. And Muslim Brotherhood groups in the United States are quite extensive and active. As a matter of fact, every major Muslim organization in the United States is linked to the Brotherhood. So the Brotherhood organizations in the U.S. are able to fool people very easily by claiming that they condemn ISIS, they hate ISIS, they don't want anything to do with that caliphate, and that's all true. But not because they reject it in principle or reject the theology. It's because they're rivals. They want their own caliphate. And so, of course, they're going to denigrate ISIS, just like Ford denigrates Chevrolet.
For some reason, I've taken the time to actually listen to Yasser Qadi's lectures against ISIS. I didn't get the Ford and Chevrolet thing. What I got was much more theological in regards to historical developments, the idea of the Kharijites and the use of violence, and it wasn't anything about Fords and Chevys. Is that just simply meant to be deceptive?
Well, I don't know if maybe
maybe
you misunderstood my analogy. What I was saying is they're both selling cars. They're both in the same business. They both want the same thing. They're just two rivals who are trying to get to it in different ways. and that's the same thing with ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood. And
so the theological element was just meant to be deceptive?
Well, it might well have been. After all, we have to remember that Muhammad said war is deceit, and the Quran in chapter 3, verse 28 says that you can deceive unbelievers. In a commentary on that verse, one of the companions of Muhammad, Abu ad-Darda, says, "We smile in the faces of some people, but behind their backs we curse them." And so that cannot be discounted as a possibility, certainly. But as I say, I'm not claiming to know his heart. The fact is, however, that Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated to the establishment of the caliphate. Groups that Qadi is involved with are connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a perfectly reasonable surmise that he has no objection to the question of the establishment of the caliphate in principle. He just doesn't like the ISIS one because it's not in his group, it's a rival group.
Would there be anything that that could be said from anyone who's ever spoken at ISNA? Are they not automatically, by speaking at ISNA, connected in utilizing your terminology to the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I'll tell you something. If I went to speak at a group and I saw a big Ku Klux Klan banner behind me, I would walk out. I wouldn't speak. And if a Muslim sincerely rejects jihad, rejects violence against unbelievers, wants peaceful coexistence, why would he go speak at a group like ISNA?
So
he
everybody
ought to
at
know
ISNA,
what it stands for.
So everybody at ISNA, from your perspective, stands for violent jihad.
I didn't say that. I said that a speaker who comes in, who may have nothing to do with this, but he should know, he has a responsibility to know who his sponsors are, and he sees that ISNA has admitted ties to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, then he should know better than to speak there, unless he wants the association and has no trouble with it.
So there's always unanimity of perspective from everybody who's involved in every conference that you speak at. There's unanimity between yourself.
No, of course there isn't. But you're okay. I think perhaps intentionally missing the point. The fact is that I am held to very strict standards, as I'm sure you are as well, in this, and that we are always tarred with associations with various people. If you look at the rap sheets on me from various leftist groups,
gentlemen, I hate to interrupt, but we're out of time. I wanted to give you both to the last second. We'll post this on our website, thelineoffire.org, and we'll put the audio up on YouTube. Gentlemen, I gave you to the last second. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.